Picture this. You're on a cliff overlooking a dark and gnarled world. You fought valiantly against gods and monsters to reach this vista, but your quest is not yet over. You edge closer to the haphazard precipice, hoping for a tactful look at the next leg of your adventure, looking for hidden treasure and hidden dangers. You think you see a glint at the base of some distant outcropping when an 8-foot-tall goat man smacks you right off the cliff. The long fall will definitely kill you. You should know better. Always check your back and corners. You quietly accept your death. Perhaps you'll do better next time. If you thought of Elden Ring or any other Soulsborne, you're right. That's usually what it's like playing these games. But what story does that gameplay tell you? Maybe you heard a hero's journey where the brave adventurer has a horrible event to overcome. I heard slapstick with dry undertones. The general themes, however, in BloodBorne, Sekiro, DarkSouls, and so on are on the grimdark side, so how can the game be both? That gentle, sweet viewer is called ludonarrative dissonance. Ludonarrative is a fancy word that is used to describe how gameplay and narrative work together. If the two support each other, then they create ludonarrative harmony and immersion. If they conflict with each other, then they create ludonarrative dissonance and break immersion. For a grand majority of games, their dissonance is a weakness in the game's design, as immersion is needed for emotional connection and impact. I know Nathan Drake isn't your average history buff, but nobody can gun down 1 million people and still be passably normal. That's something that the Uncharted games even acknowledge with their ever-famous ludonarrative dissonance achievement. I also think it's pertinent to point out that the idea of the ludonarrative is not new. The term was actually coined back in 2007 in discussions over BioShock. In the contemporary gaming landscape, more violent works are often the focus of ludonarrative discussion. This is not without good reason, as these games often pigeonhole themselves into a set few story elements that would actually support the sheer amount of murder. Such as the protagonist being a grizzled semi-psychopathic badass with a heart of gold, an anti-hero, or just flat out a hypocrite. That's also not to say that all violent video games are incapable of ludonarrative harmony, because games like Far Cry 3 exist, games like Doom Eternal exist. I want to give Halo an honorable mention for the amount of work put into creating great atmospheres and story devices, but I can't get over the fact that Master Chief is a walking fridge that needs to duck for cover every time his shield pops, so we'll pocket that one for later. For the purpose of this video, I want it to be explicitly clear that I am not condemning all violent games to have ludonarrative dissonance. I want to look at an exemplary use of it in one particular context. Despite the negative connotation surrounding it, ludonarrative dissonance doesn't have to be a flaw. There are a few cases where breaking immersion can be deliberate to change the way you experience the game. This is fairly common in the horror genre, where the player can be told that they're in a safe place before the game quickly gives them the old razzle-dazzle. Gaslighting gamers like this creates a sense of unease and mistrust in the game's foundation, but how does this fit in with FromSoftware's brand of seemingly misplaced humor? When you start any Souls game, you get an intro that gives you glimpses at how dangerous and grim the settings are. As you play, you also get small insights to the often nihilistic nature of your goals. You will also see a lot of the physical meekness of your character in contrast to the beefy enemies smacking you around all day. Even NPC quest lines often end depression and ruin lives just because you helped. To this day, I still don't even talk to Gascoigne's daughter in BloodBorne. I'd rather dream that if I don't interact with her at all, then she can find some happier theoretical ending than being eaten in the sewer. For the most part, the gameplay reflects the brutal narrative with very challenging combat and lots of dying. This is incredibly frustrating for a lot of gamers, most of which don't even finish the games. I'd actually gamble that FromSoftware is responsible for more broken controllers than every FIFA combined because of how incredibly good these devs are at understanding how people play their games. They let you know it too, by punishing your every greedy action. Obviously, the developers want you to play and enjoy their games, but difficulty is a staple to the Soulsborne experience. There's a whole different topic of accessibility in games that could be dipped into, but again, we'll have to pocket that conversation for later. Yes, they make your death the punchline of the gameplay, but they do it because they care, to cut through all the sadness and the struggle. The example I give was actually straight from my first Elden Ring playthrough. I couldn't even be mad. Of course the game humiliated me because I wasn't paying attention. And there's so many more instances showcasing Soulsborne humor. Sure, you may have just died to this boss 30 times in a row, but you can always take a break and dive headfirst into some crates. Conversely, you can dunk on that same boss with magic doot-doot bubbles and wearing nothing but a mushroom hat. Let's also not forget the many traps and wolves that appear out of thin air. My point being, these games are stressful, and the immersion-breaking slapstick undertones act as rough reminders to the players that this is all just a silly game meant to be fun, and not a self-torture sim. Take a deep breath, laugh it off, and look for some sunbros to summon. While we're at it, let's get into some science too. I'm only going to source one article for this video because in 2022 it's extremely well documented and researched how stress negatively affects normal cognitive functions. Prolonged stress can cause the prefrontal cortex to shrink, which is the part of the brain responsible for decision making, memory, attention, basically most of the important bits for higher level thinkies. You don't learn well when dealing with extreme stress, and the core concept of get good is to learn and adapt. This is where FromSoft's use of ludonarrative dissonance is truly artful. Dragging the player out of immersion with the silliness in the game world doesn't just provide a comic relief that makes the game more palatable. It scientifically makes you better at this hard game by letting your mind detach your ego from the character death. You just need to take one of the many painful opportunities the game gives you to take a step back and think about how insanely funny it is that you just got one shot by a seemingly unavoidable AoE from a giant ninja dog. As a closing thought, I would like to state that as much discourse as there has been over ludonarratives, the concept doesn't automatically have a large amount of influence on gamers. Most games with ludonarrative dissonance do not bother addressing it because they feel that the player is smart enough to compartmentalize that particular aspect or set of aspects as just part of the game. For every 100 people that have played BloodBorne, I imagine only one has questioned why the bad guys don't also revive at the nearest new use station. Hey. Sorry if the audio sounds a little weird, it's me in the future. I meant to say Borderlands 3 here, so yeah, sorry about that. Alright, back to the video. Even after seeing this flaw, that one person probably kept on playing because they still thought it was a fun game. Personally, I think it's an aggressively unfunny bloated legacy IP that's past its prime, but that's just me. On the other end of the spectrum, ludonarrative harmony doesn't magically make every dry art piece fun to play. It is still, however, very important to discuss and consider ludonarratives as games continue to evolve and perfect the style of storytelling that only a highly interactive and immersive medium can tell. To label these discussions as pretentious or outright ignore the dynamics between gameplay and story is to suppress the development of video games past their artistic infancy. And yes, video games are indeed in their infancy, as they have only really been with us for about 60 years, and have a long, exciting road to perfection ahead of them.